check out the conference program schedule for the next 2 days and evenings, because there'll be more coming. It's a really great program tonight, and it's going to be very interesting tomorrow night as well. I keep reminding myself that every once in a while we get really lucky and we get to line up our calendar with someone's availability who's really rare and unique person for us to hear. And so tomorrow night, kind of in the middle of the program, the presenter coming from the city of Baltimore, Davon Love, will be speaking about some very important activist work that he's been leading that's been extremely important to the recovery and efforts to bring a more healthy environment to Baltimore, which has been a really struggling city with a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about throughout the conference. So his visit is one that I'm very much looking forward to. Tonight we have a very interesting group of speakers who will give you different contexts within which to be thinking about immigrant rights and human rights, including right here in our own valley. So it's a theme of attention that's becoming increasingly important within our boundaries. We've long thought about it in relation to countries in other parts of the world that are suffering from severe violence or famine or different forms of serious hardship that forces communities of people to really flee the situation that they've been living in and seek refuge in other places. And that's how we've thought about human rights. But human rights are becoming more of a theme of attention for us to be talking about in our own country. And I think some of the talks tonight will bring that home. I'd like to begin by introducing our provost to come speak and welcome us. Kim Greer is a delightful addition to our campus. She came in January, so she hasn't been here long enough to experience this conference before. This is her first run, but she's generous enough to come speak to us and welcome us. Kim?
Good evening. I am incredibly honored to provide a welcome on this first evening of the Social Justice Conference, and a big thank you to Dean Twadio. I very much appreciate the invitation. I'm also representing President Jun, who can't be here today, and I know that she's disappointed about that and would like to be here this evening to be welcoming you. And as Dean Twadio mentioned, I wasn't here last year. I joined the university in January, but I have heard about the Social Justice Conference, and I really have been anxiously awaiting being able to attend my first Social Justice Conference. Like so many of you here this evening, studying about and working for social justice really has been a commitment and a passion of mine throughout my career in academia and previously in the areas of social services and the criminal justice system. The central pillars of social justice form a strong foundation for all that we advocate in terms of social change, establishing environments that are supportive of all people, eliminating inequality, and promoting inclusiveness of diversity. These are the frameworks that I think help us get up every morning and work hard and strive to make our communities more socially, politically, and economically just. Our university's commitment to social justice, equity, and access was really one of the reasons I wanted to come here from Minnesota and join Stanislaus State. Our university values actually include the following statement: we embrace diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice as vital components of educational quality. This year's conference contains an amazing array of presentations, panels, spoken word, and artistic events. Our campus is being visited over the course of today and the next 2 days by individuals from near and far with a wide range of experiences and expertise. So it is a really rich learning environment that we have an opportunity to participate in, and I hope that all of us will seize this opportunity, and that you will also share information with your colleagues and your classmates about the opportunity that is before us at this particular time. For example, if you've looked through your brochure, we have presentations that are going to be on the following topics, and this is just an example. Sustainable deployment as a basis, or excuse me, sustainable development as a basis for confronting inequality and poverty, the struggles for dreamers' access to higher education, the intersection between immigration and education, and a capstone event on Thursday evening where the playwright Milcha Sanchez Scott is going to do a question and answer session with the audience, and that will be followed by her play Roosters. So I just got my tickets today, and there are still a few seats available. So go online and get your tickets so you don't miss this wonderful opportunity. I look forward to seeing you at some of the sessions over the course of the next couple of days. And with your permission, I would like to end my welcome to you with just a brief salutation. The salutation Namaste, which means the spirit in me acknowledges and bows to the spirit in you. An appropriate statement, I think, for a social justice event. So again, namaste. Enjoy this evening's events. Thank you very much.
Good evening, all. I'm Blake Wilson, new faculty in criminal justice, and I'm appearing before you tonight to introduce John DeCure. John is an avid surfer and was born and raised in La Mirada down in Southern California. He studied English at Cal State Fullerton and then worked as a salesman for a copier company and then Motorola before he attended law school at Southwestern Law. He was called to the bar in 1990. John was a deputy trial attorney with the State Bar of California from 1993 to 1998. He's also been a defense attorney for the Dependency Court and served as senior deputy attorney general with the Office of the Attorney General in Los Angeles. He's also, there's a lot of alsos here, a member of the California State Bar's Committee on Professional Responsibility and Conduct. As an administrative law judge, John DeCure has been in the Sacramento Regional Office of the Office of Administrative Hearings since October of 2014. So what does the OAH, the Office of Administrative Hearings, do? Well, in California, when there's a disagreement with an action intended to be taken by certain governmental agencies against an individual or a business, there might be a hearing before the OAH, and Judge DeCure might be presiding over that hearing. Typically, this occurs when an agency seeks to discipline one of its licensees. For example, all the hearings before the Medical Board of California involving physician discipline are conducted before an OAH judge like John. At the OAH, John conducts mediations and also administrative hearings. Not only is John a California attorney, he's also a mystery writer. He's the author of 3 novels, Reef Dance, Bluebird Rising, which are published by St. Martin's Press, and also He Said, She Said, quite a mystery, published recently by Skyhorse Publishing. I'm pleased to introduce John's talk tonight, which is entitled Assessing the Impact of Underrepresentation on Disadvantaged Civil Litigants in the Critical Importance of Legal Aid Services. His talk will highlight the critical role played by legal aid groups providing representation to individuals whose resources are insufficient to hire their own representation. Those groups are facing the prospect of significant loss of federal funding support if the current budget proposal is approved by Congress. Therefore, from one long-term California attorney who also attended the State College and went to a regional law school and who also attempted to surf in the earlier days of his life, it gives me great pleasure to introduce John DeCure.
Thank you very much. Good evening. With that long introduction, I don't think there's anything else for me to say, so thank you. Good night. No, actually, this is a great subject that I've been asked to talk about tonight. And the first thing I have to say is, as a judge for the state of California, these are my views and my opinions only. They're not the views of the state. Jerry Brown did not call me last night to go over my PowerPoint with me. He might have tried, but my phone was turned off. I was really working hard to get ready for this. At any rate, this is a good place to start. What I'm going to do is talk with you about, first of all, the problem, what it is in terms of underrepresentation. There are particular people who are chronically underrepresented in our society, and I'm going to point out what the problem is and give you an idea of also what to look for, because there are people that we know and that we interact with who are part of those underrepresented classes. Then finally, I'm going to talk with you about what to do when you find somebody who needs help, so that hopefully you can take something away from tonight that will stay with you and might make a difference in someone's life. Let's see if this works. Okay. How does the clicker work? I knew I was going to have one of these moments. My wife is a professor here, and every time she says she tries to use the media, she has a little moment. And I think I'm having one of those. Because I've got slides, I promise you, there are more slides than this. Go ahead. Okay. I like quotes. I like hearing from other people, and this is a very wise woman. Now, I'm putting this up humorously because I think you do have to really stay lighthearted when you look at problems that are as enormous as the one I'm going to talk about tonight. I don't do Marge's voice well, so I'm just going to read it for you. You know, the courts may not be working anymore, but as long as everyone is videotaping everyone else, justice will be done. Obviously, that's not the case. Okay, here's another intelligent person who said a lot of fascinating things about justice and the law. Albert Einstein. In matters of truth and justice, there's no difference between large and small problems, for issues concerning the treatment of people are all the same. That is, I think, a really important message, because no matter who we are, our station in life, what it is, where we are on the economic ladder, the bedrock principle that we know is part of our American culture is that we're all supposed to have equality under the law, and that doesn't always happen. Okay, neither does this always happen. I think I might be pointing it the wrong way. Here we go. So this is the problem. You've got low-income citizens who really don't have access to justice, and I'm going to focus on that problem primarily tonight. But before I get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about how I began, really how I was first aware of this problem. I'm trying still to point my clicker. There it is. These are the most vulnerable people that tend to be in that class of low or no income, where they just cannot get the representation and the legal information and the aid that they need. You got veterans, the homeless, disabled, unemployed, senior citizens, undocumented immigrants, and victims of natural disasters, of which there are quite a few right now in California, especially with the fires we've had. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I first became aware of this problem. I have to go back almost 30 years to when I was a brand new lawyer. I had just passed the bar exam and was totally elated, and went and got sworn in, which you have to do to practice law in California. And about a day or so later, I still didn't know what I was going to do for a job. I hadn't started working yet. and a friend of mine, a surfing buddy, thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, I'm a surfer. He came by and he said, you know what? I've got a case that you might be interested in. It's not going to pay you anything, but it involves a mutual friend of ours, and you could really help her. And I'm just going to call her Diane. Anyway, we both knew Diane and were friends with her in high school, and she had had a very successful life up until recently. She was a phenomenal athlete, and when she was younger and competing in track and field, she actually had a world record in one of the events that she did. And so she was sort of like the toast of the town in our small community. Well, she went off to college, she did very well, she went to graduate school, she got a career going, and suddenly she really started to fall apart. She was suffering from major depression and mental illness, and she ended up in a psychiatric facility. She was heavily medicated, she had electroshock therapy treatment. She really was barely hanging on. And recently she had pulled herself together enough so that she could get out of that facility and back off some of those medications so that she could function better. She got a small apartment, she got a part-time job, and she was trying to really claw her way back into the world. And problem is, she had physical ailments at that point. From all the meds and all the treatment she got, it really racked her body, and she needed to do rehab. So she goes and she buys this very expensive, very elaborate in-home gym because she couldn't face the idea of going to a local gym and having people who knew her see her and walk over and, hey, how's it going? And then they have to hear her sad story. She just thought, I can't deal with that. So she spent basically her whole life savings on this beautiful in-home gym. And two guys came and set it up, and it took up most of her apartment. And immediately she got after it and started rehabbing. But the darn thing fell apart. And within a matter of about, month or two, it was practically worthless. She couldn't use it. And she went back to the place where she'd bought it, and she brought her contract, and they said, well, if you take a look at the terms and conditions and the warranty, you're a couple of weeks late. It's out of warranty, so we're sorry we can't help you. We can't give you a refund. And so she was despondent, and that's right about the time when my surf buddy came by just to visit her by chance. And he listened to her story, and he said, John's a new lawyer. He can solve your problem for you. That's it. And she said, new? Well, what do you mean new? How long has he been practicing? You know, and he did a little calculation. He said, well, I think he's in about his third full day. So anyway, I agreed to help her. I went over, I heard her story. She gave me a copy of the contract and the important paperwork. And so I figured out who I needed to get in front of. And I wasn't going to go back to the store because I knew they couldn't give her money back. They didn't have the authority. So I found a vice president who was not too far away, who was in charge of all the local stores. And I went and saw him. I made an appointment and came in to a beautiful conference room, and there he was with about a half dozen of his younger staff people on each side of him. And they were all beautifully dressed, and they were all smiling, kind of smirking at me, like they were there to witness my public execution. At any rate, I made my pitch, and he listened very politely, and then the VP basically told me the same thing that Diane had been told in the store. Sorry, there's a warranty, a deal's a deal, contract expired, so you're out of luck. Well, that's when, and here goes my clicker. Oh boy. That's when I became a lawyer. I had done a little research, and I had remembered this from law school. This is the Uniform Commercial Code's implied warranty of merchantability. And basically all you need to know about it, down there at the bottom, a key concept. A buyer is not going to purchase a product anticipating that it's going to fail right away. Particularly, like, let's say you buy it and it's got a 90-day warranty. You're not going to spend thousands of dollars on something that you figure will be junk within 120 days, or 160, or 180 days. The law recognizes that there's an implied warranty that goes with that sale and that purchase, and that the buyer reasonably expects it's going to be fit for its intended purpose for a reasonable amount of time. So I politely told these things to the vice president, and he listened, and he actually conferred in front of me quietly with the people he was with. And he said, you know, I agree with you. I think you do have a good case, and I think you have a viable claim, so I'm going to cut you a check. So I got the check. I was thrilled, raced over to Diane's apartment, told her the story, and I may have exaggerated a few points. I think instead of 6 people at the table, there might have been a dozen. And instead of smirking at me, they might have been armed. But at any rate, I came out on top, and I was thrilled, and she was thrilled. But I realized toward the end of the conversation, she was kind of sullen and sad-looking, and I thought, you know, I've talked too long. This is a person who's been through a lot. This is about her. It's not about me. And so I got up to leave, and I walked over to the door, and she was still there behind me with her check in hand. And impulsively, I just asked her, so what are you going to do with the money? And she said, well, I got to put most of it back in savings because it's really my life savings. It's all I've got. But I want you to know something. I'm going to break off about $200. And tomorrow, I'm going to go to the gym around the corner, and I'm going to join. And you want to know why? Well, I was dead silent. She said, you're a really new lawyer. How long have you been practicing? You know, and I did a little calculation. I said, let's see, 5 days, 4 hours, and 36 minutes. She said, right, exactly. If you, as a brand new lawyer, can go and do that, for me, can fight those people, those strangers, and come out with that check, the least I can do is get up and get out of this apartment every day and go do my rehab in the real world. Thank you. Now, when she thanked me, she really didn't need to thank me by that point because I still didn't know what I wanted to do as a lawyer. But by then, I was really being nudged in the direction of public service, which, as you can tell from the intro, that's what I've done my whole career. This is a very meaningful subject to me. And anyway, I want to talk a little more in detail now about the problem. All right, these are my sources. The National Opinion Research Center, which is out of University of Chicago, they did a very large, expansive bit of research on this, a survey on this very subject that I'm talking about tonight. And the Legal Services Corporation basically commissioned it because they were going to write a lengthy article with the findings. And the Legal Services Corporation, I need to mention, is a wonderful, wonderful agency. It was created by Congress back in 1974. And it is basically the federal funding. It's the federal funding source for almost all of the legal aid clinics in the country. They all rely on money from the Legal Services Corporation. So one other person, Deborah Rhodes, she's a professor over at Stanford. She's an ethicist, and she writes on these subjects and advocates on these subjects, and I've stolen shamelessly from her because she's such a thoughtful person. So, all right. LSC put out the report earlier this year, and that's what it's called, the Justice Gap. By the way, I don't want anybody to take notes. I don't see anybody doing it, but I don't want anybody to take notes because I do have a one sheet that's going to be available for you if anyone needs the specific references that I make. Anyway, the problem, part 1, this is what they found. 7 out of 10 low-income households have had at least one civil legal problem in the last year. So these things are coming up yearly for low-income people. 70% of those said they were very much or severely affected by these problems. Common legal problems: healthcare, finances, rental, housing, children, custody, education, disability. These are all really serious issues for them. Now take a look at this. Low-income Americans are only seeking help for about 20% of these problems. Those who said they didn't seek help are saying that they were concerned about how much it would cost, whether their issues were legal or not. They didn't know. Is this something I need to talk to a lawyer about or not? And where do I go to find help? So as a result, 86% of the problems that they reported were not addressed. They didn't get the help they needed, 86% of the time. That's crazy. Last projection in 2017, low-income people are going to come to the LSC-funded legal aid places all over the country. with 1.7 million problems, about half of them, a little more than half of them, are not going to be dealt with adequately because there's not enough funding and there's limited assistance. Now here's the really part two of the problem, the public perception. 4 out of 5 Americans that were part of this survey, they incorrectly believe that, well, low-income earners and the indigent, if they've got a civil problem, don't they get a lawyer? Now, maybe that's how it works in TV or in the movies. I don't know. But as far as I can tell, if you've got a legal problem in criminal court, yes, you have a right to an attorney. But in civil cases, generally, no. So that's a huge incorrect assumption. 2 out of 3 Americans incorrectly believe that low-income earners and the indigent have no trouble finding legal assistance. Well, we already know that's not the case. 86% of their problems aren't getting dealt with. Now here's the political perception issue that was touched on in the introduction. The White House's 2018 budget proposal looked to cut LSC's yearly funding 92%, from $375 million down to $30 million, which would have basically put them out of business. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but Congress and the Senate are still deciding. So we'll get to what you can do about that later. Anyway, this is a very dire situation. Another problem that I ask you about is this a priority for our society? Do any of us think about this as a big problem and a very important priority? So here's my question for you. What does $350 million currently buy in our country? In other words, what are Americans currently spending $350 million on a year? Okay, that could be just about anything. Okay. There you have it. Every year, Americans spend $350 million on making that little cute dog look like a superhero. Isn't it adorable? Now, look, I have nothing against dressing up your dog, but, you know, it's a question of priorities, really. And this is just a, this is a heartbreaking issue when you think about the money it takes to fund the LSC and the money that we're spending on other things. Anyway, practical impact of underrepresentation, it's almost overwhelming. These are all the things that can happen that are negative, of course, in the lives of people who don't get proper representation or legal input or advice when they need it. Wrongful terminations, suspension, all sorts of problems at work. They don't get paid, substandard working conditions, foreclosures, evictions, substandard living conditions, bankruptcies, predatory lending, abusive relationships. There are many people who are victims of abusive relationships and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to get out of them because they don't have legal input on what they can do. Medical is a big problem these days. Unpaid benefits, wrongful or frivolous denial of care and coverage, that happens. Sometimes the insurance company or the government or the employer says, sorry, we're not going to pay, and the person is really stuck and they don't know what their rights are. Loss of licensure, that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about later. But the problems are overwhelming, and here we go. This is the first step you can take towards taking action. You want to be aware, and you want to look at the people around you. I don't mean spy on them. I mean just be aware of what they're going through. Listen, hear what they have to say. If you know somebody who's been injured in a car accident, or personal injury claim, you see down there it says SOL issue. That stands for statute of limitations. You only have a year if somebody or some business is negligent and they hurt you based on their negligence. You have 1 year to act. A lawyer is going to know that. A legal clinic is going to know that. A layperson may not know that. You got all these other situations, arrested, DUIs, shoplifting. Now you do get a right to an attorney in criminal cases, but sometimes people sign deals, they sign confessions, they do all kinds of things that would hurt them without even knowing that they got a right to a lawyer. You've got someone who's considering leaving a spouse, doesn't know how custody or financial support or visitation is going to work. You need a lawyer these days. harassment, discrimination at work, injuries on the job, denial of wages, wrongful terminations. It just goes on and on. So, this is something I want you to think about as well. Is this person seeking licensure? Do you know somebody who's trying to start their life over, to get into a profession? Selling cars, caring for the elderly, for children, selling real estate or insurance, becoming a nurse. Those are like 5 or 6 of 50 examples of legal issues and legal problems that people face. Anyway, you get to a legal clinic, you talk to an attorney. If you have access, that means that you're going to have insight and preparation. And knowledge is power, that's right. Okay, this is how underrepresentation looks on paper. And I pulled these from decisions that I have to write. 2 decisions that what I do is I hear a case and I consider the facts and the law and the evidence, and then I have to write a legal opinion. And these 2 different respondents are people who had convictions, and now they wanted to get their lives restarted. They wanted to do better for themselves and their families. And so they sought licensure. And I'm going to show you how different it looks for people who have insight and knowledge and information, or people who don't. This is how they end up faring. The first, I'm just going to call this Respondent 1 and Respondent 2. First one. Respondent demonstrated remorse for his criminal misconduct. He displayed a measure of personal responsibility, admitted his mistake, but while readily criticizing his uncle and partner, Mr. Jones, that's a fake name, for Mr. Jones's fraudulent activity, Respondent was slow to concede that his own greed distorted his judgment and kept him from taking action once he discovered the scheme. Now, this is somebody who hadn't thought his way through what he'd been through. His felony conviction. This is his testimony about the felony. He hasn't thought his way through it yet. He hasn't considered, what is the state going to think? What is an agency going to think when I present myself to them saying, hey, I'm ready to deal with the public, and I need to be trusted to deal with the public fairly and honestly. He didn't think about it yet. Second respondent took full responsibility for her criminal misconduct and persuasively explained her transformation from a former drug dealer into the law-abiding person she is today. So this is somebody with a very difficult past, but she's made a change. Respondent credibly recounted the extraordinarily difficult circumstances she faced as a child of drug-addicted parents. It's quite a history, yet she did not make excuses for her criminal past and did not cast herself as a victim. Instead, she showed appropriate remorse and appeared sincerely grateful for the opportunities she's had to remake her life. This is somebody who is really thoughtful about what she's been through. All right, now a little bit more on these. Back to Respondent 1. This is the result of the evidence he presented to me. No evidence of criminal case expungement was offered. Expungement is where you go back to the court and you show them you've been doing good things, and you basically get that conviction wiped off the books. He hadn't done it. Respondent did not submit any evidence showing rehabilitation due to his embarrassment over his conviction. He failed to present character witnesses or reference letters demonstrating evidence of rehabilitation or good character. As a result, he provided the agency, this is the agency he's asking for a license so that he can deal with the public. He's asking them to give him a license to be a professional. He gave them no evidence that he's improving himself, contributing to the community, or would not likely reoffend. Now here's Respondent number 2. Each of her 4 felonies, so she had 4 felonies, but all 4 of them were reduced to misdemeanors and expunged. She presented substantial evidence of rehabilitation. Employment history with 3 different employers establishing she's highly regarded and dedicated. 2 former supervisors and the son of a former client testified that she is known to be honest, hardworking, and dedicated. So she brought 3 witnesses in to attest for what good work she had been doing. She had 3 training certifications, completed over 30 continuing education courses, and that all established that she had steadily improved herself. And it had been 20 years since her last conviction. So she'd been trying hard for a long time. 6 character reference letter writers. They endorsed her. So she had 6 letters and 3 live witnesses. This is somebody really motivated. So, okay, you're in school, many of you. I'm going to give you a quiz here. Which person had a lawyer? Okay, now I say down at the bottom, this is a trick question. Okay, it's a trick question because neither had one. Respondent number 1, he relied on incorrect advice from a friend. He told me this. That he might get a court-appointed lawyer when his case was heard. Well, that's what 4 out of 5 members of the public think, so he's not really all that far off. Problem is, he's wrong. He doesn't have the right to counsel. Otherwise, he relied on himself and Mr. Jones, this is his uncle, the same relative who was co-convicted in his felony case. So he went and got advice from the guy who got him in trouble. Needless to say, it wasn't good. Respondent 2, she did not have a lawyer, but you see what she did? She visited a legal clinic a year before the hearing, and she talked to staff who knew all about these kinds of cases, and they gave her directions and resources. She got focused, she got ready, and she did everything else. She took the classes, she got character references, she lined up witnesses, and so on. Went back to court, got expungements. Huge, huge difference. Needless to say, she is a licensed professional. He is not. He's going to have to try again several years from now, if at all. So it makes an enormous difference. Okay. For the students here, you're going to feel perfectly at home. This is another quiz. Source material for this mid-presentation quiz. Speak softly and carry a big stick. You'll go far. That's Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, what I think he really means is be prepared. You don't be cocky. Be prepared. If you're prepared, you can handle a lot of what gets thrown at you. So, our legal justice system is, here's the quiz. A, it's cooperative. B, it's collaborative. C, it's user-friendly. Or D, it's adversarial. Anybody know the answer? A student, please? D. I hear people saying D. I saw that finger up over there. Oh, 2 fingers. You're both committed. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's D. It's adversarial. By now, it ought to be really obvious to you. This is life and death stuff for people. It's really, really serious that they know what they're doing when they go into battle. So, a primary source for fighting the fight. I'm going to start telling you now how you can help people who are around you that are facing these kinds of problems and issues. Yeah, the internet. There's the Pope. He's meeting last year. I think that's Tim Cook. That's the CEO of Apple. And this is a quote from the Pope. The internet can help us to be better citizens. It can be used wisely to build a society which is healthy and open to sharing. It's really a good thing when it comes to the law and access to justice. It's amazing. American Bar Association is a nonprofit that's set up by lawyers, is very old in this country, and it has a fabulous set of resources. FindLegalHelp.org. These are all the things that people can click on for free. It could take you 30 seconds to find this site, and then you could spend the next 4 hours going through all these possibilities. Legal aid, kind of things I'm talking about. Pro bono work, where you're matched with a lawyer who will take your case for free. Free legal answers online by lawyers who know what they're talking about. Other resources, different groups have special care and treatment when they go on that site. Let's see, we've got another beautiful website set up through the bar, the American Bar, helplegalaid.org. Okay, now, if you were concerned about that budget issue, where there was going to be a 92% cut perhaps, and all this legal aid was going to go away, you can do something about it. Your Voice Matters is a page, and they have made it really, really easy. I mean, they're lawyers. The American Bar Association is a bunch of attorneys who are trying to do good things. And they make it really easy for you to figure out how it is that you can contact people in Washington, people in Congress, people who are local that come home and deal with their constituents, and you are their constituents. This is how you can get in touch with them and let them know, this is important to me, and I hope you do something about it. And what I've heard, the latest, is that they're not going to cut the program down to nothing, but it's going to take some kind of cut, perhaps. So this is still up in the air. All right, I'm a former state bar prosecutor, and I gotta say, I didn't even know that the state bar did all these things. They have a phenomenal access to justice program, and it's on the state bar's website as well. The state bar, by the way, regulates California attorneys. It's like a pseudo-state agency, but that's what they're set up to do, and they're over 100 years old. Anyway, they are working towards, look at that, they deliver $30 million a year annually in legal aid grants and projects that are promoting access to justice. So they are helping these local legal aid clinics survive. And if you think about that 30 million, that's 13% of the Legal Services Corporation's budget for the whole country. So it's just a phenomenal job they're doing, and they need your support. Center on Access to Justice is another thing the bar offers. And they offer many similar things here in California that the American Bar Association offers on its site. Pro bono, administration of lawyer referral service. What that is they make sure that if you need a lawyer, you get a good lawyer who knows what they're doing. Those lawyers have to be certified through that program. And there's various other services they provide that are fantastic. Almost too much to cover here. These are all the other things that State Bar does through their Legal Services Trust Fund program. They've figured out a way to fund low or no income legal services through the interest that lawyers earn on the client trust accounts, the money that they're holding for clients temporarily. It's a really wonderful idea. Okay, this took me about 30 seconds to find on the internet, all right? These are really simple source search. Legal aid near me. It's stuff like that is so easy. It's all on the internet. And you can find out right away with just a couple of clicks who's out there that can help somebody who really needs that help. Okay, resources that, back to the licensing thing, the guy who wanted to get a professional license but had that felony, he could have gone online, and the agency that he was seeking the license from, the business he wanted to get into, let's say it was real estate, you know, the Bureau of Real Estate. You just type in Bureau of Real Estate and he'd be on this big website for that agency. Look what they've got, disciplinary guidelines. And as I say here, they're prominently posted. And they tell basically everything that they consider that they want to look at when they're determining whether to give somebody a professional license or not, whether they're safe to deal with the public as a licensee. So it was all there for him, but he never knew it was there, he never considered it. And he didn't get the advice he needed. Okay, this dates me a little bit. That's Get Smart, that's the cone of silence down there. I loved that gag. This is something else, though, I want to pass on to all of you, is that when you're in that situation and you're talking to somebody who needs help, and maybe you're advocating for them a little bit, you're trying to really get them motivated that, hey, you shouldn't take this lying down. You shouldn't just not be aware of it and hope that it's going to go away. Maybe that's not a good plan. Maybe you need to talk to a legal aid clinic. Maybe you need to talk to an attorney. Somebody is out there who can help you. When you're in that mode, keep in mind that people are fearful, okay? Sometimes they don't even know that they've got a legal problem. And they're really afraid to talk to somebody to spill their guts, especially if they have to admit certain things that might not be easy to admit. And they think maybe they've got some civil liability or some criminal liability even. Well, you can assure them that when they talk to an attorney or a legal clinic, it's all confidential. It's under that cone of silence. The attorney-client privilege makes it basically secret. So you can confidently tell them that they can tell their problems to anybody who's a lawyer, and that person is sworn to secrecy. All right, so keep that in mind. Okay, we're near the end. I'm now going to swipe from Nelson Mandela, who I think had something excellent to say on this subject. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Yeah, this is I think the the best way to describe this is that if you can do for someone else in that moment of need, simply by helping them get to the information they need, get to the place in their mind that they need to be, so that they can help themselves and get legal access, it's going to give back to you. It's a selfless act, but then again, we all benefit from it. All right, these are my final thoughts. Be an advocate, empower others, and give a voice to the voiceless. These are the things that you all can do by simply being aware of these issues of access to representation and justice. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm Sarah Miller-Antonio, Professor of Anthropology and Associate Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Kathy Taktakin, currently the Director of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Kathy is also a member of the Women and Migration Network, and for many years, she's been involved in grassroots organizing and advocacy, particularly in the Filipino community. She works closely with environmental organizations and frequently speaks on issues of borders, the internationalization of labor, discrimination in foreign policy, and undocumented migration. She has been a strong voice in so many venues, both internationally and nationally, including the United Nations, where she was awarded the honor of Grand Rapporteur. And tonight, she will speak to us on immigrant rights as human rights, with specific reference to the Central Valley and within our current national context. So please help me welcome Kathy Taktakin.
Okay, let me get settled here. And I hope the clicker works as well as it did for John. Okay. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to join you this evening. I think what I'm going to talk about actually dovetails nicely with what John just described. I think we have some very similar messages. And I'm just very glad that at this social justice conference, you're including questions of immigration and human rights. They're really indeed concerns of the day, not just in the US, but globally. My organization works at the national and international level, and believe me, immigrant and human rights defenders around the world are very concerned about the racist and xenophobic rhetoric coming out of the United States political leadership, but they're also very heartened to see how communities and sectors have responded, whether it's the Women's March or the thousands of people who turned out at airports against the Muslim ban, or people who've responded out of concern for DACA recipients, undocumented youth and students who may have their status taken away from them. Mayors who have stood up against threats against so-called sanctuary cities. So there's a lot to be heartened about, but without a doubt, this is a very difficult time. I've been doing this work for many decades, and this is a really challenging time, and I wish I could come up here and speak with better news. But I think it's really important to squarely look at the issues that we're facing, and not have any illusions about the seriousness and the challenge that we have. I also wanted to impart, I think, just the importance, because we are talking about human rights in this conference, of really centering human rights in our lives, and how we observe events and developments, politics in the United States and the world, but moreover, how we also see ourselves as part of a global community. I think it's just really important that for those of us in the US, we resist the temptation to just look inwardly at the many problems, but especially when we're looking at questions of migration and human rights, to see ourselves really as part of a global community. So I'm just going to, saying that, jump in to a grocery list of issues. And there's actually a second slide that has a similar list. But when I say we have challenges, this shouldn't be going there. Okay, it's moving on its own. Okay. So this is a list of some of the, there's like a dozen issues that for anyone working on immigrant rights, this is what we're dealing with changes, almost on an hourly basis, daily basis, weekly basis sometimes. What has gotten a lot of attention is this rescission of DACA. This is the program that has deferred deportation for over 850,000 young undocumented immigrants. The threat is that this program will be ended on March 5th, 2018. President Trump has thrown it to Congress to come up with a DACA solution, and that is currently being held hostage to an immigration agenda from the White House that will include, as a trade-off, greater border enforcement, more deportations, a slashing of legal immigration, the slashing of refugee admissions, which has already taken place. So it's a very serious and issue, and right now we don't really see a resolution on the horizon. And so as of March 5th, it's possible that there will be a rolling date of people who are presently in that program who will lose their deferment and will be subject to deportation. Temporary protected status, which is provided for groups from countries that have faced like serious natural disasters, civil chaos. There is also the possibility that early next year, temporary protected status will be ended for people from Haiti, from Nicaragua, from other Central American countries. It's already been ended for certain African countries. There's over 300,000 people who will be affected by that. And that includes people who've lived here for more than 20 years, who have families, who have worked here. Protections for unaccompanied minors. These are the children who come across the border seeking asylum. So they have been given opportunities to kind of state their case, and I think you may have seen, news and stories about children as young as 2, trying to people trying to represent them in court so that they could state their case, and they've been in detention. That special kind of protection for unaccompanied minors is ending. Increasing expedited removal. This is the kind of ending access to justice that happens typically at the border, but is also going to be moved internally. So it's essentially skipping a lot of access to justice for people who might be deportable. Slashing refugee admissions. We've already slashed refugee admissions this year to 50,000, next year for 2018 to 45,000. So that's less than 50% of refugee admissions the United States. Cutting legal immigration by more than 50% and replacing family-based immigration with what's called merit-based, as if people who come in to the country based on family petitions are kind of ne'er-do-wells. But this is a kind of a very serious attack on what has been a cornerstone of immigration, U.S. immigration policy, which is family-based immigration. And that is being threatened to be cut by more than 50%. Let's see. Ending the diversity visa program. This has been in the news a lot because the New Yorker who ran over the bicyclists had entered on a diversity visa many years ago. It has a long history, which includes actually coming into being in order to increase immigration from Europe. It's changed over the many years. It allows 50,000 people to come in per year. They are vetted. They have to go through the regular immigration process just like everyone else in terms of application. So it's not like they put their name in a jar, someone draws it out, and yes, you can come to the United States. Doesn't work like that. Increasing border enforcement and building the wall. This is going forward. The budget for this next year includes, $1.6 billion towards increased border enforcement. And again, the cost of building the border wall is estimated to be $25 billion over the period of time. Banning Muslims from coming into the country. There's a new bill in the House which would increase exploitation of temporary migrant farm workers and undermine rights and wages for other workers. It's essentially, it looks like the old Bracero program that we got rid of many years ago. And then the threat to defund sanctuary cities. These are just some of the issues. And believe me, it's, none of these policies would come about very easily. And a lot of this, is going to be subject to debate, and resolution in Congress. But the rhetoric behind it, the threat behind it, the driving of a fear narrative, of course, has been very dangerous. And there are some very real realities in some of the takeaways that can happen. And it's not just an undocumented migrant who can be affected. Many of us live in mixed status families. There can be a citizen, a permanent resident, and undocumented in the same family. So of course the deportation of any one person can affect a whole family, can affect a community. The DACA decision, if DACA is rescinded, the business community has come out certainly against rescinding that. Over 750,000 of the DACA recipients work. So they would lose their work authorization if that program was ended. They would lose their jobs. And these are not necessarily all kids. Many of these are breadwinners. They themselves have families. They have children. So we're talking about a significant impact if that were to take place. Okay, so I also wanted to bring in a quote. And this one is from Martin Luther King, and this is part of the memorial in Washington, D.C. If you haven't seen it, it'd be great when you go visit Washington to be there. But I think the message is, do not despair. This is his well-known, I think, quote, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I think that those of us who are on the side of human rights and justice certainly are on the right side of history. But there is a lot of work to mitigate the immediate damage and certainly to change hearts and minds and to challenge policies and bad laws. This is, when we talk about human rights, I was in Geneva a few weeks ago, went to the UN bookstore, and I found this book. It's a children's book called We Are All Born Free, and it's all about human rights. And I thought, this is great, and if everyone understood their human rights in this language as it's explained to children, we would certainly all be better off. So this message says we all have a right to life and to live in freedom and safety. There's some more. We all have the right to belong to a country. If we are frightened of being badly treated in our own country, we have the right to run away to another country to be safe. We all have the right to a home, enough money to live on, and medical help if we are ill. These are human rights, and if we all understood rights as they are so simply stated in this book, I think it'd be wonderful. There's actually a great one on access to justice that shows a child beside a broken flower vase, and there's some adults standing over her, and I think it says, if someone accuses you of doing something bad, you have a right to explain your side of the story. And that was an explanation for, access to justice. But this is a wonderful book, by the way. It's on Amazon. But if you're interested in human rights and also a way to explain it, it's just wonderful. Here, I just wanted to make the connection to human rights and immigrants, and I think sometimes there's a belief that in this country, if you are not a citizen, you do not have human rights. And that's certainly not the case. And it's not the case in any one country. It's certainly not the case globally. And while some of us would want to make us believe that that's the case, it's not true. Migrant rights are human rights. One of our biggest concerns in how we look at human rights and where is actually at the border. And we have an initiative called Just Borders in our organization to try to lift up the notion that borders have been dangerous places. They're places where people often lose their national identity. If they don't have immigration documents, they may be crossing under very dangerous conditions. And we think we certainly need to raise awareness that, especially at the situation of the borders, where there's abuse and loss of life, especially for those who are forced to cross the border without immigration documents, that we also have human rights at international borders. And so we have goals set out to kind of raise awareness. And, as I mentioned, even in the debate around DACA, increasing border enforcement is actually one of the big issues that has been used to, I think, draw fear in people's minds about people who are crossing the borders. They're rapists, they're criminals, they're murderers, and that somehow people who are crossing borders aren't deserving of justice, they're not deserving of human rights. And by extension, that's why Muslims should be banned from coming into this country. So that's one of the reasons why we know that the border issue is a very sensitive one to people. People are concerned about national security. The question is, not having our national security offset the principle that human rights also exist at borders. And interestingly, this is some of our board members who are in South Texas looking at the mass grave sites of unidentified remains of migrants. So at the border, even though actually border crossings, border apprehensions have been decreasing over the last probably 5 years, the rate of migrant deaths has increased. And that's because of just the danger of people crossing in more dangerous areas because of the level of enforcement. And it's actually put people in more difficult situations, and there are relatively more migrant deaths. Many of them are buried in these mass grave sites, and especially in Texas, where it's actually against the law to do that without DNA testing, but they've been doing it. And the University of Texas has a program that's actually exhuming graves and doing DNA testing. And working with people in other countries, especially from Central America and Mexico, who are trying to find out what happened to their loved ones. So it's also, it's just part of that closure. This is one of the organizations that we work with. And because addressing the situation of the border also is a challenging and a long-term question, one of the things that a lot of border community groups do is to just try to save lives. And one of the simple ways that they've been doing that is to set up water stations. And they've worked, in a place like Texas, there's both public lands, but there's also huge ranches at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so they've had to work with ranchers to negotiate access to the ranches to put up water stations. And this is what a water station is. It's a barrel where there's jugs of water inside, and there's a long pole, and a flag usually has a red cross at the top so that people can see it. And something as simple as that has saved lives. It doesn't address the issue of people crossing the border without documents and what's going to happen to them beyond that. But it does help to save lives. And actually, in doing this whole project, it's also just raised a lot of awareness in communities, and including in the ranching community, where it's a very politically powerful force in states like Texas. These are crosses that represent migrant deaths that an organization in Tucson, Coalición de Derechos Humanos, has been putting together for many, many years. And they're actually overwhelmed at the moment with the number of crosses because there are just thousands of people who have died at the border. So they're finding a new way. They're working with the university to actually catalog and recognize these migrant deaths. But it's a very powerful symbol of the problem that people don't have safe access to cross the border. We've worked a lot with the United Nations on this issue and others. And one thing that we have helped to put together is this guideline on principles and guidelines for human rights at borders. And it makes the point that international borders are not zones of exclusion or exception to human rights obligations. So this doesn't introduce any new rights at borders. It merely pulls together existing rights from different conventions and agreements in one place as they're applied to the border. It's a non-binding document, and it's really, I think, the work of groups like ours, civil society, advocates, that have to work with governments to try to have them address their human rights obligations at borders. So it's not just internally, but certainly at the border. Maybe just to draw out also this global context of migration, because I think when we talk about, again, human rights, immigration to the U.S., it's really this global context that helps to inform our work. So not only recognition and respect for the human rights of all migrants, but how we need to make links to advocate on other global policies towards people and earth-centered sustainable development, for example, how we address the root causes of migration, and doing that in a way so that eventually migration is a choice and not an act of desperation for safety and survival. So someone told me that, in a perfect world, if we didn't have rampant poverty, unemployment, lack of justice, if we had democracy throughout the world, we wouldn't have refugees, probably. But we would have migrants. But it would be based on choice and not something that's forced. It's a concept that stuck with me because I think so often migration is associated with something that's bad. But migration, which has been around since, from the dawn of time, is a natural phenomena. And it should be by people's choice. And it is part of the global community that we work with, that we're part of. But obviously that's right now, a lot of migration is forced. So we have over 260 million people who are in migration around the world today. About 25% of that population would be defined as refugees. Almost half are women. And of course, when women migrate, there are children in migration as well. So that's been an increased phenomena. And some of the things that continue to drive migration are what we look at this kind of these intersecting circles. So still trade and development agreements that favor the global north. So we look at uneven economic development between the global south especially and the global north. Although most migration actually takes place in the global south, it's not south to north, it's actually within the south that we see most migration. What we call managed migration policies among governments. And that's, looking at migration largely based on market-driven policies and commodifying migrant labor. And today we see that mainly in governments, if they're offering immigration programs, what they're offering are temporary work programs. So the family-based immigration that we have in the United States actually stands out in many ways as an enlightened immigration policy compared to typically what we have around the world. And then the third circle are the repressive immigration and border enforcement measures. So in the United States, beginning with the Clinton administration, we have what we call deterrent immigration frameworks. And that's the belief that if we just make it hard for people to migrate, they won't cross the border. If we add more agents at the border, if we build that wall higher, people are going to be deterred from coming. If we throw them in prison, if we throw them in detention centers when they come without documents, that's going to deter people from coming. Well, it doesn't work that way. People will continue to do continue to come out of that level of desperation if they're forced migrants. But that is the dominant framework in the world today, a deterrent framework. And what it means is that we have the growing phenomena that maybe you see in the media of large, what we call large movements of people. And they're often mixed migration flows. So refugees and migrants walk along the same path. And they often come with the same circumstances. And what distinguishes a refugee and what distinguishes a migrant is increasingly very difficult to identify and separate. And in fact, this is kind of the problem in global migration governance that a group like the United Nations is having to address now, because our old policies that once governed migration patterns really don't work. They can't address this phenomena or this. The thousands of people who are dying, hundreds at a time, who have died, in the Mediterranean, crossing from Africa and from the Middle East to Europe. This kind of phenomena over the last few years is then what signaled and has pressed countries and through the United Nations to say, well, yeah, we need to do something else. So over the last couple of years in particular, the UN has been involved in a process to create what they call global compacts, one on refugees and one on migration. We've been very much involved in the one on migration. It will be negotiated, both of them will be negotiated and completed in this next year, but it's an attempt to move countries to think differently about migration and refugees, to think about programs that provide safe, orderly, and regular migration. And that can mean many things. So safe, orderly, and regular migration can mean temporary work programs. As civil society advocates, we're trying to move that to mean something else beyond temporary work programs. But it is a significant development. We work with other organizations similar to ours, and this is a proposal from civil society for the Global Compact that has lots of good things in it, and it's really an ideal vision of what migration policy would look like. There's some handouts actually on the table in the back. If you're interested, it's further in that. But, it includes a lot of the more immediate things, but it also means talking about ending the drivers of forced displacement. So I know we're going to have someone who's going to speak, for example, about Sustainable Development Goals, which is another initiative at the UN. But we know we have to address things like the development, fair, sustainable development in many countries around the world. We need to address climate change. Over 25 million migrants, of that 260 that I mentioned, are climate-induced migrants, and that number is growing exponentially. For countries, especially low-lying island states, Bangladesh, in the next 10 years, they estimate that over 50% of the population of Bangladesh will be in Dhaka, in the capital. And I've been there, I was there last year. It's incredibly crowded. But already, over the many years, climate change has an impact, not just with the rise in water. We're talking about temperature changes that have affected what people can grow. They can't grow the same crops anymore. There is no work. And if you add to that resource depletion of forests and things like that, it's an impossible situation for people in some countries. And certainly not just Bangladesh, it's happened in many countries around the world. So that's definitely something that we have to address, but that's long term. So what do we do in the meantime when people really have no recourse, where there's no work, where their children have no education, they have no access to health care? So how do we begin to manage all of that in a way that's fair and just? So these are the big questions, but they are on the table, and we'll hopefully see where it goes. I wanted to mention. Let me go back one. This is a poster for International Migrants Day, which is December 18th, and I just want to use this to say that probably the cornerstone document at the international level on human rights for migrants is the International Convention for the Protection of the Human Rights of Migrants, of migrant workers and members of their families. And it was passed in 1990, approved by the UN General Assembly on December 18th. International Migrants Day is December 18th to mark that day. But it's the second lowest it has the second lowest number of ratifications of all United Nations conventions, 55, which shows the controversy of migration. No developed country has ratified this convention. So of those 55 ratifications, all came from migrant sending countries. At most, Egypt and Mexico, which signed it, are transit countries and migrant sending countries, and they also receive migrants. They've signed it. But the US has pretty much said, don't be silly, we'll never sign it. And they won't. I'm convinced they never will. But it's an indication of how challenging this question is, not just in the United States, but at the, really at the global level. And so just to maybe emphasize this work on the Global Compact that's going forward right now, what a major step it is. But it only got to the table because there was such an uproar about the millions of people who have gone to Europe from other countries. And we're talking about, over 4.5 million Syrians who've been displaced, many of whom have gone on to Europe. It took that to signal the international community that maybe we need to do something about migration. Here's another quote, similar, I think, to John's closing remarks. This is another one from Martin Luther King, in which he says, "Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation, of your country, and a finer world to live in." It's just a beautiful image. No one is free until we are all free. This is part of our global commitment. And again, this is just some of the work that we're involved in. Our network largely works with communities on the local level, at the state level, but we've really tried to make that global commitment and be part of a global community, especially on migration. You know, I think we would encourage all of us to think in that ways and to find ways in which we're looking at our local experience, how that can fuel our work around national policy, because that's also where the rubber hits the road. And we know that in doing work at the international level, all of this is just talk unless we get countries to actually change their policies in law. It's just we'll have a nice set of words, and this is something that we're always very concerned with. And I'll just say at the present, you know, it's a challenge. We work with the U.S. State Department team that is participating on the compact. There's actually a rumor the U.S. is going to completely pull out of the discussion on the compact, but the U.S. still has a lot of weight in these discussions. And we just think it's very important that all of us, you know, continue to bring our voice to the table, both with the United States, but as we can to create that space and do that at the global level as well. So thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our speakers today. I'm learning so much already. My name is Stacy Farenthold, and I'm an historian here at Stanislaus State and the director of the Francis Sargis Modern Assyrian Heritage Project. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you all to Mona Resho Malik. Mona Malik is an Assyrian activist who emigrated from Iraq to Chicago in 1969 at the age of 9 years old. This is when the Ba'ath Party took control of Iraq's government. As the granddaughter of genocide survivors, surviving the 1915 genocide against the Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks by the Turks and Kurds of the Ottoman Empire, Mona has devoted most of her adult life to the Assyrian cause. She has volunteered with nonprofit organizations for the last 26 years, targeting her assistance to help Assyrians in Iraq. Her nonprofit work with the Assyrian Aid Society of America has led to multiple trips to northern Iraq, the most recent of which being in August of 2016. For the past 3 years, Mona has also traveled to New York to participate with the United Nations Forum for Indigenous Peoples and to Washington, D.C. to advocate for Assyrians in their homeland. Mona's goal is to bring awareness to the plight of Assyrians and to their struggle to persevere and thrive in their ancestral homeland, Assyria. Tonight she will be sharing with us some words on connecting immigrant populations to their indigenous roots, their obligation to be a voice for their indigenous community in the homeland. With that, I give you Mona Malik.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. And I'm very happy to be contributing to this program and to the introduction, Stacy. What I'd like to, the way I want to contribute to this discussion of social justice is as it relates to the immigrant populations and the capacity to be the voice of their indigenous community. So in other words, the principles of social justice, they not only affect the immigrant, the quality of life of an immigrant, let's say like in the Central Valley where it's home to diverse immigrant community, principles of social justice can also be the determining factor to either facilitate or hinder the immigrants need to maintain a connection with their indigenous roots. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail and what I mean by that. But for now, I just want to say that I really admire this conference, and it has assembled, just like Dr. Greer said, an incredible lineup of experts, and their focus on social justice topics like human rights, legal representation, comprehensive immigration policies, inclusiveness, and equality. So I look forward to learning from them, and I entrust those details to the experts. And my address, and I'll address my talk from the perspective of immigrants who have been forcibly uprooted from their native home. And since my humanitarian work predominantly pertained to Assyrians of Iraq, I'll be referencing the Assyrian experience from that region. So divided into 3 parts, I'll discuss the immigrant experience in terms of displacement and assimilation as they cope with inherited trauma. And finally, these 2 topics establish the premise by which the Syrian diaspora communities bear the burden to be the voice of their indigenous community. At times, we encounter that voice of the indigenous people through literature, and at times through poetry. And when we encounter their voice through poetry, it's mostly in the form of resistance from victimhood and the threat of impending genocides in the homeland. So to unpack all that, the immigrant experience, it's vital, it's actually crucial that we make the effort to at least consider and understand the experience, the ordeal that an immigrant must endure, and the desire for healing. And that desire for healing usually, most often, is overlooked by the host country. People who've been forcibly displaced from their homelands to become refugees or have been resettled in a new host country face issues of security, cultural identity, citizenship, and otherness. Regardless of motive behind emigrating from one's home, once arriving in the host country, assimilation becomes the focus. In one regard, the natural progression of life in order, primary school, high school, college, career, dating, marriage, kids, buying a house, etc., things that we take for granted. All this comes to a screeching halt for a refugee or an immigrant. So they have to work harder to catch up and to get back on that track. So sometimes refugees or immigrants are, when they're displaced, they're in that in-between place, whether it's in a refugee camp or in a temporary hosting country. And so that parent or that child is probably missing school for anywhere from months to years. So there is no date as to when they can get back on track again. So some quick statistics on some short statistics. Per the UNHCR 2016 report, 65.6 million, I think this was mentioned before, 65.6 million people were uprooted from their homes by conflict and persecution. So just to have a perspective on the sheer size of that number, 65 million is the population of the United Kingdom. 65 million is larger than the entire population of Italy or South Africa. And this graphic illustrates that only 0.3%, it's that little sliver on top that shows 3, only 0.3% of immigrant or refugee refugees have been resettled. So what is it, like, I think it's 189,000 out of the 65.6 million. So the reality is that the immigrant and refugee human condition is a component of more people in the world than ever before. And one region that has been critically affected by human displacement from continued conflicts is the country of Iraq. And it has experienced one of the darkest periods in its history. So due to these conflicts, the Central Valley has been a favored destination for thousands of Assyrians beginning from the turn of the 20th century. Fortunate for recent incoming immigrants in the Central Valley, there are a number of support systems in place, and with this transition and resettlement in their new home, including our own community having the population and the means to help as well. But of course, more still needs to be done. Nevertheless, that wasn't supposed to go there, but anyways, that's the next one. Nevertheless, the vulnerable condition of a refugee is inescapable. So you have language barriers, concerns of acceptance, an uncertain future in terms of career and job opportunities. By that I mean, like, if a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher arrive here and they have their certificates and licenses from Iraq, let's say, well, they're useless here. So if it's an older person, they're not going to be able to go back to school and start from ground zero. So they're either changing their careers, they don't work, or they find any low-level job they can to make a living. So again, the preoccupation with assimilation that hinders that sort of organic human progression that I was talking about earlier. So the chronicles of an immigrant's journey to the Central Valley can be very complicated and at times very painful. We need to be aware of that, we need to empathize, and we need to accept our differences. So as I was working on this, I put this in really quickly at the last minute because as I was working on my talk last week, I noticed that there was this interactive exhibit taking place in Oakland called Force from Home. And of course, I was very curious because that's what I was writing about. And it's sponsored by Doctors Without Borders, and it just ended last Sunday, but it's traveling to other cities, one of them being LA, and I'm not sure if it is elsewhere. And its purpose was to expose the conditions facing refugees worldwide. So they were doing it through virtual reality, 360-degree video presentations. Visitors interacted with materials gathered from refugee camps, from like sea rescue missions, emergency medical projects around the world. Now, of course, not all immigrants and refugees are exposed to such extreme conditions, but we can all agree that most immigrants and all refugees are forced to leave their country of origin. Because if given the choice, even to an immigrant these days, as Kathy mentioned, they would rather be able to live and thrive at home in their country of origin, to be around their support system and their families and friends that they grew up with. As far as referring to Assyrians, being in our homeland for the last 6,000 years, I mean, we would rather be living and thriving there. That's our first choice. So it was great to see an event focused entirely on the extreme refugee experience. And in a few minutes, we'll also be seeing a short documentary about an Assyrian survivor who was displaced multiple times in his life, only to have hope in the end and a wish to go back to his homeland. So going back to our topics, beyond assimilation, immigrants are also dealing with inherited trauma as descendants of genocide survivors. In the past decade, studies have been conducted, and of course more research needs to be done on how severe psychophysiological trauma can be can have intergenerational effects. So through DNA of exposed parents and offspring, mostly of Holocaust survivors, scientists are discovering that trauma, the effects of trauma can be inherited. The point is that this information most definitely pertains to us. Assyrians have endured multiple massacres and genocides. There's not one Assyrian in the world who does not trace their family genes back to a genocide of World War I. And the most recent genocide perpetrated by ISIS opened old wounds that never really had time to heal. Assyrians Assyrians now who had to flee were living, or the stories of, or I should say, the nightmares of their parents, the stories that they heard from their parents and grandparents. So I believe that the essence of the study pertains to us, and maybe the reason why most of the people in diaspora specifically do not react with a sense of urgency when an atrocity happens, like ISIS. Because the reason is that we've been distant from it for a while, because we've carried this gene of hopelessness and defeatist attitude and cynical outlook toward our own capabilities. Therefore, more recent arrivals of immigrants have a deeper attachment to the homeland and feel the obligation to advocate for and promote awareness of their persecuted communities in the homeland. As an Assyrian immigrant myself, as a descendant of genocide survivors, both of my grandmothers were survivors of the 1915 Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocide, I feel an obligation to bring awareness to the immigrant experience. And I believe that all people, regardless of ethnicity, religious experience, religious affiliation, or geographic origin, who have been forced to move away from their homeland, they all share the same sense of loss, the same longing for home. The collective memory among a community with a history of multiple genocides should be preserved. And why is that? And because it's a crucial part of the community's intangible cultural heritage. So you have museum collections, heritage sites, books, language, traditional dress, cuisine, customs, they're all tangible components of our heritage. Whereas if collective memory remains undocumented, it will be forever lost. So with that, I want to introduce this film, and while we watch Mr. Yohanna and listen to his memories as he talks about how his mother helped him to survive. So it's 6 minutes, if you guys can do it. Is there a way to turn down the lights a little bit?
The Semele massacre began on August 7, 1933. Thousands of Assyrians were slaughtered as Arab and Kurdish forces raided the district of Semele in northern Iraq. The Assyrians had previously been disarmed and were defenseless against the attacks. Men were rounded up and shot dead. Women and young girls were raped and made to march naked before the Iraqi commanders. Children were run over by military cars, pregnant women stabbed with bayonets. The massacres were indiscriminate. They killed men and women, young and old.
سميلة ناشي رقلي ولا برمتة وقطلتة وسميلة ورقلي ناشي بليل بيوم أرقي ورابة مني قتلي ولا برمي ولا أنا إيون وسورة تنياوى يمي قالي يمرا آتي سورة وإثوال اشتيرخ أنا إثوالي اشتيرخ القفلتي منها.
Yohanna's mother left everything behind and fled alongside her neighbors, carrying him in her arms. But he would not stop crying, and this posed a risk for others, who insisted she leave him behind.
قلت إن أني شمي والي قال تأتي يفدوقي ولا قم برمي والي كلها ليش وقي وأبقى يعني أفهمت من ليز أبري وهم زميوها ولا خب طارق ولو خيانا أنت بقربة أغذال بلكي نيخة هم زميوها قد برمي والأغذال تلشمي والقالي قرداي قد أذي دوقي والي برمي والي رابا بجنجر رولي.
Finally, she was given an ultimatum. She was either to leave her son behind or part ways with the group. Bravely, she chose to go alone.
أني كل بيزالي يوم أغذالي أني قمر خلنا رابي البرونخ ومخلص ريشخ يمرأ أنا بروني لي رابينا ين أنا وبروني مخلطنا ين ميدخ مغذال لا قم رابيالي قم خلطانا خلص لآي وخلص لي أنا إيجا إيدا أنتي تخار ليمي زعمتي لا يمي يقدر تخرنا هي باخر قال دي إياها مسب يمي خبختها رابس بايابا ما يرنتاوا يمغباوا ناشي لاوا من بغداد تمز ما والناشي ينهنا رابا زودا من لازم سبما يمي قمتا ويا تمتا بابا ويما ميثي واي سورتاوا قمتا وقبيت بو خالاذا اي ما يوداوا ان سوراي ديان ماثا يسقيوا لهن الطورة من دي قطي وطرب وهن وذي وقعر وقت ميثيوا اي جماعة ليال سورة ماثا كلها كسلدية متى ولا قد خانش شنورة بشلا ولا ودريا ولا يمي خلتا قد أخليوا كلها مسمى وبانا هل قد ديريما ناشاي بابا ويما ديريما من طورة كما يدوال لبة وكما يدوال حنية البرونة دي تلاقى مرفيعا.
Yohanna and his mother managed to rebuild their lives in Syria, where they were reunited with his father in the Assyrian town of Tel Arbush, along the Khabur River. He went on to become one of the executives of an oil company, where he worked for most of his adult life. He married and had 7 children of his own, 3 sons and 4 daughters. His own family is now scattered across the globe as a result of continued oppression and persecution against Assyrians. Today, he resides in the town of Skokie, Illinois.
خلوق طارد بيتك ورخصي أي لويته منن.
Though he's been away from home for 17 years, he remains hopeful that one day he will see it again.
النويلة أطراي قداش تنوي وهي والقا أطراي إن أنا هاون طاخ دير التامة قرا كل أطراي دير التامة الأطراي أطري إيه كيلة وإراق أخني أطران إيوة وإراق ليه أطر عرباي ينت قرداي إيوة وأطراي كودو كتخبرات انفجت أثرات أن إليت أطراي وإراق وسوريا وكل خدوك ما روخ وطابخ من آلها قد بلتها وخفرقانا هيك وانقبار كل جلة رجال كلها راي أتراي وأخني أن يوماذا تيري بابا ويما وأهواذا وجنجر وإريق ومقمل وممطيل هل لي دار جدية ليلة تخمون بداي ولت لي تو تخمن هذا
This was done 2 years ago, so he's 85 now. So the arts have always been the guardians of intangible cultural heritage, and in this case, it was film. And yeah, that's good. The film captured and preserved Mr. Yuhana's memories. So in diaspora, we have a need to maintain connections to our ancestral homelands and an obligation to be the voice of our indigenous communities. At times, they are persecuted and silenced, so we need to be their voices. In diaspora, we have the freedom to express, to advocate, to demonstrate, to vote. Today was voting day, and make a difference when our communities in the homeland cannot. So one thing I wanted to mention in the beginning, and actually Kathy mentioned it as well, is that I keep using the terms immigrant and refugee very freely and very interchangeably to each other. And I know there's a difference, but I feel like there isn't one these days, because I believe that in the end, once they arrived in their new host country, both immigrants and refugees experienced similar hardships of acculturation, acceptance, vulnerability, cultural identity, and most of all, a longing for home. Since cultural identity and homeland are inseparable. So my premise is that the root of all displacement issues always point to the human desire for a home, right? I mean, we all desire for the stability, the security, the comfort, the warmth of a home, and we take that for granted. And I mean, just imagine having to leave your home, and you have very little time to plan for it, and you know that you're never going to see it again. So there it is. So you see, to be displaced and stateless, an immigrant or a refugee is a demanding predicament. Deprived of a natural and organic progression of life as a human condition that we, as I believe, as a global community, have yet to reconcile with and remedy. Although we are resilient and somehow find a way to cope, the longing for home and our indigenous roots remains a symptom of displacement. So I hope that this presentation sheds some light on the magnitude of displacement as it tests the limits of the human condition, and that our actions, our words, our social justice policies play a critical role in mitigating that impact on the immigrant, thus helping to enrich cultural diversity and human creativity. Thank you, and that says Push Bishlama, which means leave in peace in Assyrian. Thank you.
I have the privilege of introducing our final speaker, a gentleman who had a distinguished career before he walked into my office one day and just said, "Hi, I'm Andrew Conte, and I wondered what's going on at your university." And it was all because his wife got a job in Modesto, and he was retiring soon from his position of 30 years plus as a distinguished professor of political science and international relations at the at Minnesota State University, Moorhead. And he was looking to continue to be an active and engaged faculty member if there was any way for us to find a place for him. And we definitely had a place for him. And since then, we've had the chance to talk on several occasions, and we've even spawned a plan for next fall when we will be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Human Rights Proclamation with a conference that will involve people that we'll bring out from the United Nations and other speakers as well. And I thank you, Andrew, for making that a reasonable option for us to pursue. I would never have known where to turn for the speakers, so that's the main thing that makes it important. But I thought that it was very important for us also to hear from him. He has a very distinguished career. He's an unusual person for us to bring to the stage. From 1976 to 1981, he was Sierra Leone's ambassador to the USSR. So he was there during the Brezhnev-Kosygin years, which were very dramatic years in American-Russian relations, and they were relations that influenced a great extent of the entire world with competing structures of power and issues that affected other lives in very profound ways. So he was there to experience that. Then served as a delegate to the United Nations General Assembly in 1981-82. So he has actually served as a delegate in the General Assembly of the UN, and that's an experience itself that's I think very distinctive, and was the Deputy High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. So he's had several very prominent roles to gain experience. He's coming to us this evening to speak on the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which there's a link in the program on our webpage, so you can actually click and go in and take a look at what that document entails. It's an amazingly complex statement of what is needed to bring about sustainable development as a basis for confronting inequality and poverty among underrepresented populations of the world. So he's going to bring us back to some of the types of thoughts and themes and feelings that we started with this evening, but on an international scale. Dr. Andrew Conte.
Thank you, Dr. Trudeau. Let me also thank all those who have been very grateful, generous with their time in organizing this conference. I'm in Tulloch, I think partly because of Dr. Tulloch. I was debating when my wife got a job here, whether I should come or not. When I walked into his office, I was really amazed. He welcomed me. And since that day, I still have it down in my diary. It was on the 23rd of June, 2015. And so I said I will go, because I think he is a gentleman, and I have not been disappointed in him. I thank you, sir, for receiving me here. This evening, I'd like to engage you in a brief discussion relating to sustainable development in the United Nations. But before we do so, I'd like to remind you that you hear a lot about international organizations. Some of what you hear may be pleasant to the ears, but oftentimes what you hear are negative. you hear about peacekeepers engaged in organizing prostitution rings. Or you may hear about the fact that the United Nations was rather slow in responding to Srebrenica as well as to Rwanda. Sometimes you also hear about the World Bank and its structural adjustment and its impact on economic development. Furthermore, you hear awful things about the United Nations Commission for Refugees when it engages in repatriating refugees who may not yet be ready to return home. You hear about the World Trade Organization and its environmental policies, etc. The list goes on. But this evening, I want to engage you in looking at the United Nations and its program for sustainable development. But gentlemen and ladies, before we do so, I want you to note, first and foremost, what the United Nations is and what it is not. United Nations is an international organization. Its members are mainly nation states. It is nation states that participate in the United Nations. Consequently, these nation states function in accordance with the United Nations Charter. And this charter did not organize or establish a supernatural body. In other words, United Nations is not a supernatural body. It is a collection of nation states. In other words, United Nations reflects the member states. Reflects the member states. And the reality of the matter is that the P5 still hold immense powers within the United Nations. The reality is that despite the fact that United Nations has been in existence for more than 70 years, it was the great powers that formed the United Nations. It is the most conservative institution, in my humble opinion, on earth. The most conservative in the sense that post-war agreement or arrangements that were made in Dumbarton Oaks, or cemented in Yalta, and finally in San Francisco, they are still in place. They have not been touched. Consequently, when we think about the United Nations, please, I want to appeal to you, go back to history and look at the factors that contributed to its emergence. But mind you, this organization of nation states is based on what we call the United Nations Charter. And this charter is an international agreement providing for rights and responsibility of the member states. And you know something, guys? Since 1945, the charter has been changed, no, not changed, amended only 3 times. Only 3 times. First, its amendment came when the membership of ECOSOC was increased from 15 to 27. Second, when ECOSOC was also increased from 27 to 54. And thirdly, when the non-permanent members' membership was increased from 5 to 10, making it 15. These were the 3 times when the charter has been amended. For 70 years, no other amendments have taken place. It remains to be that which was agreed to in San Francisco. And now, let's look at briefly the legal framework of the work of the United Nations in regards to, say, sustainable development, or in regards to its activities in the social sphere. The preamble, Articles 1, 2, 51, 55, 56 clearly demonstrate, clearly say to us that the organization has an obligation not only in terms of maintaining international peace and security, but that it is also charged with the promotion of economic and social well-being of people. This is fundamental to its work. The social aspects, as well as its undertakings in Article 2, demonstrate clearly that for the United Nations, the maintenance of international peace and security are closely tied to the protection of human rights, the maintenance of international justice are closely tied to social justice as well. In other words, security issues, ladies and gentlemen, are not simply about the acquisition of, say, arms, but that security, from the perspective of the United Nations, also depends on the promotion of fundamental human rights. And today, in the jargon of the United Nations, we refer to that as human security. It is not only the state that should be secured, but human beings have to be secured. And where human beings are not secured, that surely is a recipe for disaster. That surely is a recipe for conflicts among nation states. That surely is also a recipe for internal conflicts. Therefore, when social justice issues, human rights issues, ladies and gentlemen, are violated, then United Nations will fail in carrying out its fundamental obligation, and that is the maintenance of international peace and security. And over the years, United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, has therefore focused on the following. It has focused on the following, such as peace, development, human rights, And finally, it's also focused on this issue of independence. Before I continue, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to provide you with a brief definition of what human rights are. You may want to know that human rights are basically those rights you enjoy ipso facto because you are a human being. Because you are a human being. Consequently, human beings are not defined by geography. They are not defined by skin color or gender. They are not defined by economic status. You enjoy them because you are a human being. But having said so, I would like you to note that from time immemorial, despite the fact that we know that human rights are those rights you enjoy because you are a human being, you have to struggle for them. Many times you have to fight for them. And when you fight, you got to ensure that those rights that you have acquired or won, they have to be protected, etc. The two world wars were about human rights. And so, the Charter clearly also protects human rights in various articles, like the preamble, Article 1, Article 2, Article 13, Article 55, Article 56, Article 72, Article 76, guys, of the Charter. United Nations has adopted many documents on human rights, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. 1948. The Convention Against Genocide, 1948. The Covenants on Political and Civil Rights of 1966. The Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The Convention on Migrants. The Convention on Enforced, ladies and gentlemen, imprisonment, etc. We have a lot of them. However, ladies and gentlemen, what is universal still remains to be the human rights violations. What is universal are the human rights violations. Furthermore, as we talk about the United Nations, I'd like you to remember, as you and I talk, the global environment is today characterized by inequality and exclusion. Inequality and exclusion. These are two major challenges of today. Globalization, yes, has brought immense gains. Globalization has helped many, etc. But guys, would you agree, and I would like you to agree with me, that globalization is cruelly unfair? Because, ladies, it has increased wealth in the hands of a few and left many behind in all parts of the world, both developed and developing, north and south, face greater inequality and marginalization now than ever before. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the level of marginalization and inequality in both North and South are rather great. Consequently, unless nation states work together, poverty will continue. Unless nation states work together, unless nation states are willing to join hands together in their struggles, and in particular in the struggle against poverty, the international community should be prepared for more internal conflicts. And these internal conflicts, as you very well know, do have a major impact on development. On development. But guys, before moving on, I'm sure you want me to tell you first, what do we mean by this sustainable development now? What is it? In the eyes of the United Nations, and according to many, sustainable development can be defined as a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I'm sure you want to hear this again. I'm sure you want to hear this. Let me repeat it. Sustainable development can be defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In sum, sustainable development superimposes upon us the need to recognize our responsibility to the future generation. Sustainable development, guys, is about the acceptance of an intergenerational responsibility. Sustainable development in this regard imposes upon us concerted efforts towards building an inclusive and sustainable future of people of our planet. The future of people of our planet. Ladies, since the 1960s, the United Nations has constantly paid attention to the issue of development. When at a time, development was seen only in terms of the pocket. Development was seen only in terms of how large or how big the pocket was. We moved away from the pocket now to sustainable development. During the Millennium Meeting in New York, the Millennium Development Goals were adopted. The Millennium Development Goals, still in existence, but now they have been, ladies and gentlemen, augmented by another important document known as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This document, gentlemen and ladies, was negotiated over the period of 3 years within the United Nations. Hey guys, within the UN, when you negotiate, you can't get everything. You have to compromise. Consequently, whatever documents you see coming from the United Nations, you must view them as compromises among nation states that have various interests, etc. Various interests. The interests of developing countries are often also enshrined, as well as the interests of the developed nations. The agenda has 17 goals and 169 targets. 169 targets. Dr. Twitter said that you should look at this document online. And I would like you please to look at it. And if you promise me that you're going to look at it, I will therefore not read everything that I have prepared for you. I will, ladies and gentlemen, therefore, try to analyze it. I will try to, ladies and gentlemen, put it in a way that at least you are able to understand it, read it, etc. With that does, let us look at the distinctive features of this document. First and foremost, the agenda is unequivocally anchored in human rights. This agenda, ladies and gentlemen, is explicitly grounded in the United Nations Charter. It is grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is grounded in the international human rights treaties, documents, etc. And above all, it is grounded in the right to development. The right to development. Secondly, the agenda balances as well various paradigms on development. Various paradigms on development. But the most important paradigm in development is the human being. Development should be people-centered. It should be people-oriented. Next, the program, the agenda looks at existing inequities. How to combat the inequities and discrimination in the global arena. Consequently, the agenda is based on the principle of leave no one behind, either in the developed or developing country. Leave no one behind. Leave no one behind. Next, having said that, please note that this new agenda also is based on the principle of universality, and the principle of indivisibility of all the goals. Let's go back. Let's look at universality. Let's look at universality. Universality, gentlemen and ladies, means that the 2030 agenda rests on universal values, universal standards, and that these universal standards are expressed in human rights. They are expressed in human rights. They are indivisible. They are interconnected. They are all interconnected. You've promised that you're going to read, gentlemen and ladies, this agenda. And therefore, I hold you to it. Consequently, I don't want you to go home thinking that it's all so good at the United Nations, that this document is going to resolve all our problems. It's not going to do so. What are the challenges? What are the challenges? Let's look at the challenges that we are faced with in the implementation of these documents. The first challenge, surely, is the existing inequality or the persistent poverty. Persistent poverty. Or, number two, the fragility of many economies. The fragility of many economies. Number three, another major challenge is unemployment among the young. Among the young. Among the young. The third or fourth challenge is on sustainability, on sustainable patterns of production, on sustainable patterns of consumption, on sustainable use of natural resources. Gentlemen and ladies, these are serious issues. On sustainable use of natural resources. The resources of many places are not in the hands of those people. They are in the hands of multinationals. And when multinationals mine their natural resources, you know, the environmental degradation that occurs in those places. There's unsustainable use of natural resources. Some do not have the resources, in fact. Lack of resources of many nation states. As we talk about these challenges, I want you, ladies and gentlemen, not to forget about the nature of the global economy. Don't forget about the nature of this global economy. The global economy is capitalist in nature. This global economy is characterized by that division between the North and the South. The wealth is controlled by those in the North and those in the South, in the periphery. Ladies and gentlemen, they produce what they do not eat and eat that which they do not produce. They produce what they do not eat and eat what they do not produce. So, the nature of this global economy must be taken into consideration when we talk about the challenges that nations are going to be faced with. Most nation states, their people do not pay taxes. A high level of tax evasion. How do you pay for these services, etc.? Let's don't forget about climate change. Climate change and others. These are just, ladies and gentlemen, a few of the challenges. These are some of the challenges. Well, but you're going to ask me, is there a way out? What's the way out? What should we do? Allow me to present to you some of my biases. Number one bias would be that, ladies and gentlemen, there is a need, a very strong need for us to bring on board the national actors. There is a strong need for us to forge a sort of partnership between the national actors. And these national actors could be the local actors as well. In other words, local and regional actors should stand out as the key stakeholders to ensuring the fruitful implementation of Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. For sustainable development. Secondly, gentlemen and ladies, what is also necessary is that there is a need for the local institutions to challenge national institutions or authorities in what or how they distribute the local resources. Local resources. You remember, guys, a former lawmaker in the United States of America by the name of Tipper O'Neill, right? Tipper O'Neill often said that all politics is local. Tipper O'Neill didn't make any mistakes. He said all politics is local. The agenda for development is a local agenda. And so therefore, local and regional authorities should be the primary stakeholders in the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And besides the locals, governments surely have their narrow interests, vested interests, they have their economic interests, etc. We should ensure that the topic, the issue of development is talked about, debated at the local level, the state level, the national level, etc. With this, let me thank you for listening to me. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I I will take some questions, guys, because I'm the last speaker. Yes, ma'am.
As far as the prevention of, the Office of the Prevention of Genocide, Adama Dieng.
Right.
And then you also at the same time had Samantha Power leading during the time where genocide was committed in Iraq. And Samantha Power wrote the book, the power, the power from hell or something like that. But it had to do with Americans and genocide. What do all these offices do? I mean, how does the Office of Prevention of Genocide exist and it didn't do anything?
Again, I said to you, the UN is a political organization. And if we know that the UN is a political organization, and don't forget also, who pays the piper calls the tune, right? He who pays the piper calls the tune. If I am paying, then you have to be sometimes careful with me. Who is the major contributor to the United Nations? United States of America. Contributes about 22% of the budget of the United Nations. Number 2, Germany. Number 3, Japan. But Germany and Japan are not members of the Security Council. And so that's the political reality of the United Nations.
You have Saudi Arabia running the human rights.
Yes, that's the reality of it. It's not a perfect institution.
But are they doing anything? I mean, is anything being done at all?
Yes, it does other things, particularly in the social sphere that I was talking about. It has helped in the eradication of diseases in other parts of the world, taking care of children, etc. But it is not a perfect institution.
No, of course not.
It is not a perfect institution. Don't point fingers at the UN. Point fingers at the nation states that are in the UN.
So the individual states.
Yes.
The individual members.
Yes. The UN is not a supernatural body. I say. It's not there standing up on nation states. And these nation states hold on to their national sovereignty. They hold it so tight to their national sovereignty. Our fingers should be pointing at individual nation states and not at the United Nations per se. Come on. But we always say the United Nations, right? That's what we always say. But why can't say the member states of the United Nations?